Howdy gamers, welcome to another Cube video. Today I'm going to be talking about what I refer to as the original recipe Twobert, my first ever Twobert design that I put together first 5 years ago now. Today I'm going to be going over what went into that design, kind of looking at how it ticks, and hopefully offering some insights on how you can approach designing your very own Twobert. Let's dig in. A question that I'm often asked is, Ryan, what the hell even is a Twobert? Rough definition, a Twobert is a 180 card cube designed to be played by 2 or 4 players. Couple things here, 180 cards is a slightly arbitrary number. That is kind of the generally accepted minimum number to draft with 4 players. I kind of designed around this number so that I could draft with either 2 or 4. Notably, I use a different methodology drafting with 2 or 4 players. With 4 players, you can just draft something like 3 15 card packs. We use 5 9s in my groups, and then I use a different methodology for 2 players that I refer to as Minneapolis Draft. I outlined this in my article when I first launched the original recipe Twobert. That article was regrettably titled The Proper Way to Do 2-Player Cube Drafts. There's nothing really proper or right when it comes to cube. I always say your cube, your rules. It is just a way that I've enjoyed drafting better than any other 2-player draft format, so your mileage may vary, but 2 or 4 players. A lot of people also ask me, how can you draft with 3 players? Honestly, I don't have good insights on that. When it comes to my friends, usually the third person just hangs out and watches. And maybe you have a fun way that you draft with 3 players, more power to you. This video and the construction of this cube, I'm going to be going over some guidelines that probably sound pretty rigid, but it is all flexible stuff. That 180 card number, you might do more if you want a little bit more variance in your 4 or even 2-player drafts. And if you are only playing with 2 players, you might go to a lower number just so you can more control the variance of your environment. There's no right way to do it. This is just a way that I have found really works for me. I started exploring the space of designing a smaller cube because I used to have a weekly cube group that we would intend to get 8 every week. It was often just me and my friend Mike playing cube, and we found that when you draft a cube designed for 8 players with only 2 players, you usually don't get decks that really look like what you're trying to draft in that desired 8-player experience. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't come together. You don't get all the pieces for all the synergies into the cube, and something that I always found was aggressive decks really struggled, and that's just something that always requires a high volume to work. Your aggressive deck is looking for a lot of cheap creatures, some interaction, and if you have anything that doesn't really fit the mold, you get really awkward draws really quickly. The workarounds for this using a large cube tend to involve house rules, seeing a lot more cards than usual, and you still see some cards that you still are never going to play when it comes to the 2-player experience, just because they don't really work even with this kind of finagling. And I always found that this house rule stuff led to kind of information overload. Some combination of your deck's not working and you have to process too many information even just to get playing in the first place. I definitely wanted to design something specifically geared at playing with a smaller number of players, and I've been very happy with the results exploring in this space. I'm not the first person who ever designed an 180 card cube or a cube of a smaller size, but when I set out to do this, I was not able to find good resources to help me with that. So hopefully my writing over the years and this video today are helping to spread the word and to help more people explore their creativity and design in this kind of space. So why is it called a Twobert? It's a stupid name, I get it. It's kind of referencing my goals with the design. I wanted to build something that's easily drafted by 2 players, so Twobert. It's sort of an inside joke kind of thing in my old cube group. We would call a cube a Cubert, a riff on the old Nintendo game, and then drafting with 2 players is a Twobert. So just kind of brainwormy, memey stuff there. One thing I like about the name is even if you don't know what it means, you know that it means something. Like, you don't think I accidentally said something and it was supposed to be something else when I say Twobert. Like, it's this weird specific thing. So you know I'm talking about something. And maybe you're curious and you ask about it. Maybe you just go on not knowing what it is. But it is a name that grabs attention in that way, which I like about it. When that first article on my original Twobert was published, the word Twobert made it into the blurb on SCG, which was kind of funny, kind of priced me in to continuing to refer to as that. I will say that there is a group that refers to cubes of this size as bar cubes. To me, that name is slightly awkward because it's evocative of something else. When I hear bar cube, I think budget, I think maybe unsleeved. There's nothing there that's inherently referential of the size, which the 2 in Twobert kind of gets you to. Even if it is a nonsense, stupid name, it's at least clearly the name of this thing. So that's where I'm at on that. The reason that I've started to refer to that first Twobert as the original recipe Twobert is that it is really just a recipe for designing cubes. It's as much as a template for future designs as it is a cube itself. And there's kind of 4 guiding principles that really go into that really make it work. So I'm going to go over those quickly and then I'll expand on them in order. The first thing that I really used to employ to make sure that this cube is playable was what I've come to refer to as a macro-archetype. Each color is seated as a 23 card deck so that you're just shuffling 5 decks together in a sense. I paid high attention to the mana curve of the cube at large, so it's not just the mana curve of those 23 card decks, it's considering the fact that there's only so many total, 4, 5, 6 drops on the entire cubes, and all that stuff ensures that the cube is playable the first time you sit down, and then I use gold cards and mana fixing to try to bolster the replayability of the cube, so it's a little bit different from time to time. When I refer to a macro archetype of the cube, what I mean is that every card in that cube falls under the umbrella of one archetype. There's an entire deck archetype for the cube. When we did a podcast about this on the 540, I referred to this as the one thing. I hadn't really figured out the language yet, but really I like macro archetype because it just means there's just something going on with the entire cube where every card kind of supports this general archetype, and you would generally put all of the cards in the cube in a deck of this archetype, even if the entire cube shuffled together wouldn't necessarily be a functional deck. There are different directions to take it within that macro archetype. You could still label everything under this one thing. For the original recipe Twobert, that is mid-range. If you're not super versed in competitive Magic deck archetype names, a mid-range deck is just somewhere between an aggro and a control deck. It has aggressive elements, it has disruptive elements, and it's generally a deck that is good at positioning itself, either to be the aggressor or the controlling deck in a given matchup in a given game state. So you're either pressuring your opponent or you're reacting to what they're doing and trying to play a controlling game, and really the defining aspect is that you can kind of move between these roles as the game dictates. For every color in Magic, there are 23 cards of that color in the cube, at least monocolored cards, and they are assembled to be sort of a 23 cards plus 17 basic lands deck. I have the white deck, as it were, spread out here. You can see what I'm talking about with this sort of mid-range deck. It has a coherent curve, few 1s, a lot of 2s, some 3s, some 4s, maybe a 5, and then you have 1 6-drop. I'll get back to that later when I talk about the mana curve of the cube at large. But what you see here, a lot of creatures, some interaction for creatures, fairly planeswalker heavy environment, and that it really lends itself to that mid-range macro archetype, because a lot of the games are going to be about trying to set up your own planeswalker, trying to pressure your opponent's planeswalker, and then figuring out when you're supposed to be pressuring your opponent's life total, when you're able to actually close the game in that way. And the general idea here is if I take 5 just 40 card decks here and shuffle them together, we should be able to draft 2 or 4 decks out of that environment. So kind of a heavy-handed way to curate it, but I really wasn't sure how to design this kind of thing when I set out. And this is a way that I knew if I did it this way, it would at least work. And it has proven to be true. This does just work. And the playability of this and the replayability of this environment has far exceeded my expectations. I've had this cube together, like I said, for 5 years now. So this maybe seems really heavy-handed, maybe feels a bit prescriptive, but this works. So that's the biggest endorsement I could possibly give to this kind of design, is this definitely works. There's a lot of ways to iterate on this, to vary this, but if you just start with this as a baseline, you will be able to design a cube that is draftable and playable. Now let's take a look at a screenshot of the Cube Cobra page for the cube. This is just all 5 colors spread out just on that Cube Cobra page. Sorted by card type, also sorted by mana value here, and this is to show off that mana curve of the entire cube I was talking about. A big thing to point out is that I have one 6-mana spell in every color, exactly one. I get a little bit fancy with this. Green gets a 7-drop because green is the big mana color, but largely the mana curve of the cube is built kind of bottom up from the 1-drops in the cube. They'll dictate the early turns of the game, and then top down from those 6-drops, so you know what the game is building towards when you play against a given color. You won't always play these 6-mana cards, and not every player is going to draft one. Sometimes you do just go under, but their existence in the cube does dictate what you want to do with your other slots. A big thing worth pointing out is once you identify you want a really strong 6-drop in your cube, you want to put in Elspeth Sun's Champion, you want to put in Grave Titan, that puts a lot of pressure on 5-drops. And because of that pressure that the 6-mana cards put on the cube, a lot of the 5-mana cards in my design here have some kind of modal casting cost. Virtue of Loyalty, Muldrifter, Shriekmaw, Overlord of the Hauntwoods, these are all cards that can be cast for less than 5 for some lower effect, just because when you know your opponent is likely to be casting a 6-drop in a given game, sometimes you want to position yourself so you can just do something earlier, and you can't always have a bunch of 5-drops in your deck. A lot of 5-mana cards can really be outclassed by 6-mana cards, assuming reasonable balance of the cube. That's just kind of how Magic works. A recent change that I made to the cube when it comes to 6-drops was slotting in Overlord of the Boiler Bilges over Inferno Titan. It was something that I didn't necessarily love when I first did it, just because Overlord's not really a true 6-drop, every other color gets a true 6-drop, but red is really a color that would like to cast its 6-drop for less than 6 mana. Being able to just play that for 4, deal 4 damage. A lot of the cheaper red creatures are going to benefit from this card existing in the cube relative to Inferno Titan. I may revert this change, but I do kind of like the way that it expresses red's color identity, very similar to the way that Hornet Queen is something that expresses green's color identity. So every color brings a 23-card deck along with it. The cube has a mana curve consideration at large from color to color, and then we pepper in some gold cards and mana-fixing lands to make that environment more replayable, to give players options to explore outside of that cookie-cutter 5 decks that were shuffled together there. This is nothing new. I hardly invented gold cards and mana-fixing lands. This is just something that's in every cube, but I talk about it this way because that's how I approach the design. I have 3 cards for every 2-color pair, and generally my goal here was to get players to play 2 or 3 colors, so it makes a lot of sense that I have 2-color fixing lands, 2-color gold cards, and somewhat similar to how I was designing 23-card decks, every 3 cards in a given 2-color pair were selected to be generally playable within the same deck. I think drafting ends up with some weird signals if you have Azorius cards where one of them doesn't necessarily play with the other. You end up in a spot where maybe you see one of the gold cards go last, and that sends a signal that color is just open, when what's really happening is the card is just not appealing to the player in that color pair. So No More Lies to Fairy Hero of Dominaria, Supreme Verdict, this stuff is all just great in a Azorius control deck. Mid-range deck. The gold cards in the cube tend to be a bit generic. Teferi is pretty boring, but that is intentional because that means you'll be more able to mix and match into 3-color decks and to combine the gold cards from any combination of overlapping gold cards, once again supporting that macro-archetype. When it came to selecting lands from the cube, I basically just took the numbers from a 360-card cube and cut it in half. I tend to find that I want 60 2-color lands in my 360 card cubes just to make it so mana bases are consistent and effective, so yeah, just cut that in half. I tend to like 60 mana fixing lands in 360 card cubes, and I usually have fetch lands and fetchable duels in those cubes. I have at this point worked on some Twoberts that have fetch lands and fetchable duels. The mana base gets really consistent that way. I'm trying to get players to play 2 or 3 colors in this environment, so I don't have fetch lands here. If you're interested in 4 or 5 color decks, you can definitely include them. I find that that leads things to be pretty soupy, specifically when your macro archetype is mid-range. Color tends to stop mattering in that environment, which I find kind of boring, and rather I like to have some excitement in your mana fixing lands rather than just serving as a means to an end. Creature duels do a lot of heavy lifting in this environment. Celestial Colonnade being kind of a big draw to being blue and white. This creature is just quite good at blocking, quite good at pressuring planeswalkers, and quite good at pressuring your opponent's life total. And then I have a cheeky Prismatic Vista peppered in there for taste. There's a little bit of landfall in the cube. When you get the Tireless Tracker plus the Prismatic Vista, it feels like you really did it. And it's nice just to have a land that's not necessarily better than any of the two-color lands, but that every player is going to want to have access to. So it's something that is appealing to see in the draft and makes the decks a little bit more consistent by existing. The original recipe Twobert was my first Twobert design. I have somewhere in the ballpark of a dozen together today, and these foundational aspects of designing that cube really will go a long way in helping you design your own environment. I still follow a lot of this stuff, even though I do deviate in some ways as it comes down to what I want to build around. I'm always starting with a macro archetype. I find that having a macro archetype for a small environment is going to be the path of least resistance for making it playable. I haven't always used this, specifically if you wanted to do something like a pre-modern Twobert, something that references a specific time period, then you really do just want cool cards from that era, but kind of keeping in mind that you do want these cards generally to work in the same decks. You want to make sure you have homes for every card in your cube. Realistically, many of those time capsule cubes do end up with mid-range as a macro archetype anyway, so you may as well be explicit about it. You might save yourself a little bit of a headache in the development. And when it comes to mana fixing, you definitely want to provide sufficient but not abundant mana fixing. You want decks to work, you don't want to make it so just drafting all the best cards and whatever lands come around allow you to shuffle together whatever you drafted and beat everybody else. I will say that those monocolored decks that I seed in these cubes, when they come together, when somebody does actually shoot the moon and try to play monocolor or near it, they tend to go 2-1. And I couldn't really think of a more natural or better endorsement for that plan, just because it means that your cube is pretty well balanced. Yes, I got all the green cards, and I could not win all of my matches. It incentivizes that exploration. It incentivizes mixing and matching colors, picking up gold cards, mana fixing lands, and not just zeroing in on that seeded experience. And it gives players agency, which is really the most important thing in Cube. The reason that we are drafting and not just playing constructed is because we want to express ourselves as players. That's definitely a very important thing to keep in mind as a cube designer, is making sure your players don't just do what you want them to do, but they do what they want to do. And on the topic of doing what you want to do, get weird with it. Have fun. I have a lot of rigid guidelines outlined here. Deviate where you want to deviate. Build something messy. Build something creative. Build something goofy. Build something weird. Build something fun. This is Cube. This is a game that we play for fun. We must never lose sight of that. It's really flattering to me when people emulate my cubes. I hope that you have a blast with them, and I hope that this look under the hood has helped you appreciate this design more, and more so, I would love if the tools I offer today are useful to you in designing your own new environments that I think you'll love even more. But now I need to turn my attention to preparing for the regional championship in Portland. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.